matter of
right, because my presentation is it's minimised some pages.
Right, you should be able to open mine as well, because it will work like a Word file and whatever, having two separate files.
Also in here?
No, it's the same, so I've got to open the policy.
Oh yeah, okay.
Let's just remove.
I specialise in the reign of Edward II and have had several books published about Edward and his times. My talk today is about a young nobleman called Hugh Despenser the Younger, who became Edward II's great favourite in 1318 and who wielded considerable power in England and Wales for the next 8 years or so and made himself enormously wealthy by doing so, made the mistake of alienating Edward's queen Isabella, who had him grotesquely executed in 1326. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here today to talk to you about the man who made himself the richest and most powerful man in England and Wales in and after 1318, and who was executed in November 1326 by Roger Mortimer of Wigmore and Queen Isabella. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to Hugh Despenser the Younger. So if we could just, I don't think all of you can probably see this family tree of Hugh's, but don't worry because I'll talk you through it anyway. So the first really important member of the Dispenser family was Hugh the Younger's grandfather, who inevitably was also called Hugh Despenser. This Hugh Despenser was born about 1223 or a little earlier and was appointed Justiciar of England in 1260. This Hugh Despenser was a very close and loyal ally of Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester, during the baronial struggles of the 1260s, which we heard about from Andrew earlier today. Despenser the Justiciar was killed fighting for Montfort against King Henry III and his son Lord Edward, the future Edward I, at the Battle of Evesham in August 1265, and Despenser was buried alongside Simon de Montfort before the high altar in Evesham Abbey. It's possible that Despenser the Justiciar was killed during the Battle of Evesham by Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, by this I mean the one who died in 1282, because according to one chronicler, decades later, Hugh Despenser the Younger swore revenge on Mortimer of Wigmore's son and grandson for his grandfather's death at the Battle of Evesham. Hugh Despenser the Justiciar married Aline Basset, who was the only surviving child and heir of Philip Lord Basset, a royalist baron of the 1260s, who was a close friend of Henry III and his brother Richard of Cornwall. So Basset's sizable inheritance in 8 counties therefore passed entirely into the Despenser family as a result of this marriage. The only son and heir of the Despenser-Basset marriage, the man known to posterity as Hugh Despenser the Elder, was born on the 1st of March 1261, so therefore was just 4 years old when his father was killed at the Battle of Evesham. His widow Aline married her second husband, Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk, sometime in or before 1271, but had no further children with him, so Roger was the last of the Bigod Earls of Norfolk. Hugh Despenser the Elder himself married Isabella Beauchamp, the eldest daughter of William Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and Maud Fitzjohn. Isabella was the older sister of Guy Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, the man who is perhaps best known for abducting Piers Gaveston, Edward II's first great royal favourite in 1312. Isabella Beauchamp was married firstly to the Marcher Lord Patrick Chaworth, who died in 1283, leaving as his heir his and Isabella's baby daughter Maud, who was born in 1282. Maud married Edward I's nephew Henry of Lancaster, who later became Earl of Leicester and Lancaster, albeit not actually in Maud's lifetime. Maud was the mother of Henry of Grosmont, the first Duke of Lancaster, the great-grandmother of King Henry IV, and the older half-sister of Hugh Despenser the Younger. So the widowed Isabella married Hugh Despenser the Elder probably not too long before the 21st of December 1285, when King Edward I confiscated their lands and goods because they had married without his permission. They had 6 children, 2 sons and 4 daughters. The dates of birth and even the birth order of the 6 Despenser siblings are not known, but they can be narrowed down by reference to the dates of their marriages. So my assumption is that Hugh Despenser the Younger was their second child and was younger than his sister Aline, and therefore I would estimate that he was born perhaps in about 1288 or 1289, which would make him about 4 or 5 years younger than Edward II, and about 1 or 2 years younger than his nemesis, the younger Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. Dispenser had only one brother, Philip, who died in 1313 when he was barely even 20, but Philip left a baby son and therefore founded a cadet branch of the Dispenser family in Lincolnshire and was an ancestor of the Seymours of Wolf Hall, among many others. Dispenser's 4 full sisters also made good solid marriages into the English nobility and married into the families of Burnell, Hastings, St Amand and Camoys. So I'd really like to emphasise at this point that although Hugh Despenser the Younger was a newcomer among the Marcher Lords in and after 1317, he wasn't a newcomer to the English nobility, and he certainly wasn't an upstart or a nobody. He was the grandson and nephew of Earls of Warwick. His other grandmother was the Countess of Norfolk, and his brother-in-law Henry of Lancaster, his half-sister Maud's husband, was also the brother-in-law of King Philip IV of France, as well as being the nephew of King Edward I of England. And it was Edward I of England who arranged Hugh Despenser the Younger's marriage to the King's eldest granddaughter, Eleanor de Clare, in May 1306. Hugh Despenser the Younger was knighted with Edward of Carnarvon, Prince of Wales, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, I think also Roger Mortimer of Chir, and more than 260 others in Westminster on the 22nd of May 1306. And 4 days later he married Eleanor de Clare in the Palace of Westminster in the presence of her grandfather, the King. Despite the abundant evidence that the Dispenser de Clare marriage took place in 1306, there's long been a misconception that it was in fact Edward II who arranged the marriage of Dispenser to his eldest niece Eleanor de Clare after Hugh had become his favourite in about 1318. This misconception presumably arises because Edward II did arrange the marriages of Eleanor's 2 younger sisters, Margaret and Elizabeth, to 3 of his male favourites in 1307 and 1317, Piers Gaveston, Hugh Audley and Roger Damery. But it was certainly Edward I himself who decided that Despenser the Younger made a suitable husband for his 13-year-old granddaughter Eleanor in 1306. So Eleanor was the eldest daughter of the King's second eldest daughter, Joan of Acre, and her first husband, Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, who we also heard about from Andrew earlier today. Edward I paid Hugh Despenser the Elder the massively large sum of £2,000 for his son and heir's marriage, and the marriage of Despenser and Eleanor de Clare proved an extremely fertile one. Their first child, who was inevitably called Hugh Despenser, because what else would he be called, was born in 1308 or early 1309, and their youngest child, Elizabeth, who later married Maurice Berkeley, who was a grandson of Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, was born in December 1325. Altogether, Hugh and Eleanor had 4 sons and 5 daughters who survived childhood, and at least one other child who died young. We heard just before from Paul about the military campaign to Scotland later on in 1306 after the mass knighting at Westminster. Hugh Despenser the Younger received letters of protection on his wedding day, 26th of May 1306, to take part in this campaign as well, but he was not one of the young knights who absconded from the campaign to go jousting on the continent. So in 1306-1307, Despenser the Younger was the grandson-in-law of the elderly King Edward I, and then in July 1307, his uncle-in-law succeeded his father as King Edward II. Despite this close family connection, Hugh Despenser the Younger remained totally obscure for about the first half of Edward II's reign. His wife's sister Margaret married the King's favourite Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, in 1307. His uncle Guy Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, abducted Piers Gaveston in 1312, shortly before Gaveston's execution, and his father, Hugh the Elder, was chosen as one of the 7 godfathers of Edward II and Queen Isabella's eldest child, the future Edward III, in 1312. Additionally, charter witness lists reveal that Hugh Despenser the Elder was at court extremely often in the first few years of Edward II's reign, and indeed was one of the King's closest allies and advisors. One chronicle, the Vita Edwardi Secundi, even says that Despenser the Elder was the King's only noble ally in the crisis year of 1308, when Edward II was forced to send Piers Gaveston into exile. That's actually not strictly true, but it does demonstrate how close Hugh Despenser the Elder was known to be to the young king. And bear in mind, like his own father, Hugh Despenser de Justicia, had died in rebellion against Henry III, his son, the future Edward III. Despite this closeness to Hugh Despenser the Elder, Edward II almost completely ignored Hugh Despenser the Younger. Possibly he disliked him, perhaps he was totally indifferent towards him, though he was extremely fond of Despenser's wife Eleanor, his eldest and seemingly his favourite niece. Eleanor often visited her uncle at court, she often attended Queen Isabella. Edward often sent her money, he wrote to her and sent her other gifts, but despite his obvious great affection for Eleanor and for Hugh Despenser the Elder, Edward II acted as though Hugh Despenser the Younger didn't even exist. Hugh the Younger didn't even witness a single charter of Edward II until May 1316, 9 years into the king's reign. Later on in his career as a royal favourite, he witnessed almost all of Edward's charters. The references to Dispenser before 1314 are few and far between. For once, he was actually in the king's presence on the 5th of August 1309, during the parliament Edward was then holding at Stamford, although Dispenser wasn't actually summoned to that parliament. It seems that he and his father entered the king's presence together because they both successfully requested favours from the king on behalf of several Dispenser adherents. And in 1313, there were 3 further occasions when Hugh the Younger managed to reach Edward II's ear for once and requested favours on behalf of the College of St. Elizabeth in Winchester from Edward II. But that was the extent of Despenser the Younger's influence with Edward II in the early years of the reign. 4 small favours in 6 years. It's really impossible for me to overstate just how insignificant Despenser the Younger was for the first half of Edward II's reign. It's possible that he followed the political lead of his uncle, the Earl of Warwick, rather than his royalist father, Warwick being one of the English barons who was most implacably hostile to Piers Gaveston and by extension to the king. In late 1311, the Lords Ordainer, the group of earls, barons and bishops who had appointed themselves to reform the king's government, household and finances, including the Earl of Warwick, demanded that the king's knights who had left court with the specific intention of assaulting Hugh Despenser the Younger should be removed from Edward II's household. The names of the knights who had left court to attack Despenser the Younger are Sir Edmund Bacon, Sir Robert Darcy and several unnamed others. Whether Edward II knew about this assault on Despenser in advance or whether he had perhaps even ordered it is not clear, though it is clear that Despenser had managed to annoy Edward II greatly in early 1310 by going overseas to joust and remaining on the continent jousting for much of the year 1310, even though Edward II had expressly prohibited this. So in early 1310, Edward II orders Hugh's 6 manors to be taken into his own hands, which is extremely useful for historians because it means that we know that at this stage of his life, now that he was in his early 20s, Hugh Despenser the Younger did not actually own any lands of his own whatsoever. It turned out in March 1310 that the 6 manors which Edward II had confiscated, Wicks, La Marche and North Weald Basset in Essex, Kersey and Layham in Suffolk and Oxcroft in Cambridgeshire, in fact belonged to his father, Hugh the Elder, who had merely assigned the revenues of the manors to his son and daughter-in-law Eleanor, in line with the promise he had made to Edward I in 1306 that he would provide the young couple with £200 a year in land. By my reckoning, in fact, these 6 manors only provided Despenser the Younger with an income of about £155 a year. And so we can compare this perhaps to Piers Gaveston, the Earl of Cornwall, who had an income estimated at around £4,000 a year. Hugh the Younger's young brother-in-law, the Earl of Gloucester, had probably close to £7,000 a year. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was wealthy enough that in 1309 he was able to lend the sum of £4,000 to one man. He lent Edward II £2,000 in 1312, and there are numerous other records of loans he made to other men, both to King Edward II and to others, £200 here, £500 there, and so on. So Hugh the Younger's wife Eleanor had brought him into the royal family by marriage, but her brother Gilbert the Younger, born in 1291, the Earl of Gloucester, was their father's heir, and she brought Despenser no lands at all for the first few years of their marriage. And as we see from his income of around £155 a year, by the standards of his family and his class, he was extremely impoverished. So apart from these few references to him, which I've already mentioned, it's impossible to know what Despenser was doing for the first 7 or so years of Edward II's reign. and he was really extraordinarily obscure. And under normal circumstances, this situation would have continued until his father, Hugh the Elder, died, and he came into the rather large Dispenser Bassett inheritance. However, all this changed in 1314. In June that year, Edward II took a huge army to Scotland and was defeated at the Battle of Bannockburn by Robert Bruce, King of Scotland. Both Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father fought at the Battle of Bannockburn. It seems that they were among the 500 or so knights who galloped away towards Dunbar Castle with Edward II in the aftermath of the battle in the king's successful attempt to evade capture. And it's possible that Dispenser the Younger came to Edward II's attention at last because of his conduct in the battle, because in the king's 7th regnal year, which ran from July 1314 to July 1315, Dispenser is named as a Knight Banneret of the royal household for the first time. And he was also summoned to Parliament for the first time in September 1314, a Parliament held at York. That Edward II still didn't really like or trust Dispenser, however, is revealed by what happened next. Dispenser's brother-in-law, the young Earl of Gloucester, was killed at the Battle of Bannockburn, and he had no children. Therefore, his three sisters, Hugh's wife Eleanor, the eldest sister, and her sisters Margaret and Elizabeth, were set to inherit equal shares of the Earl's enormous inheritance across England, Wales, and Ireland. However, the young Earl's widow Maud, daughter of the Earl of Ulster, claimed to be pregnant and kept on claiming to be pregnant, in fact, for several years. I see some of you already know the story. 20 months after the Battle of Bannockburn in February 1316, in fact, at the Parliament of Lincoln that Paul has just told us about, Dispenser the Younger was told that the Countess of Gloucester was certainly carrying her husband's male child, and although the pregnancy was admittedly somewhat delayed, she was expected to give birth to her husband's son and heir at any time soon. So basically, it kind of, the whole question of the Gloucester inheritance turned into a bit of a farce. So Edward II's motives in pretending to believe in the Dowager Countess of Gloucester's pregnancy are fairly obvious, because he would continue to receive the income of the late Earl's lands until the late Earl's putative son came of age, i.e. at 21. And the Earl of Gloucester had been an exceedingly rich young man and was the second richest nobleman in the country in the early 14th century, after Edward's cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. So as late as December 1316, 2.5 years later, Edward II was still pretending that his nephew Gloucester's lands were in his own hands because of the minority of the heir. So Hugh Despenser the Younger, as the husband of the eldest sister and co-heir, kept begging Edward II for his and his wife's lands to be given to them. He wrote to the king, he petitioned the king, he went to see the king on several occasions, and Edward II turned him down flat on every occasion. And in fact, Dispenser and Eleanor didn't receive her lands until November 1317. In later years, Edward II fell over himself to give Hugh Despenser the Younger anything he wanted, but at this stage in his life, he obviously didn't still like or trust Dispenser very much, because he just thwarted Dispenser endlessly at every turn. So in November 1317, Hugh and Eleanor finally received a third of her late brother's estate, including the great lordship of Glamorgan in South Wales, and Dispenser's income increased something like tenfold overnight. Dispenser always had a great talent for quarrelling with and provoking people, and immediately started feuding with some of his neighbours, with some of the other marcher lords who held lordships in South Wales, including at this point John Gifford and William de Braose. Dispenser also took the homage of the tenants of the Lordship of Gwynlwyn, which had originally been part of his Lordship of Glamorgan, but was now separate from it, and had been given to his wife's sister Margaret and her second husband Hugh Audley. Edward II ordered Dispenser to withdraw the homage of the Gwynlwyn tenants in March 1318 and to cease occupation of the lordship. So we can see that as late as March 1318, Hugh Despenser the Younger is still not in Edward II's favour. However, Dispenser the Younger was always ruthlessly determined to get whatever he wanted, and later in 1318, Margaret and Hugh Audley handed over to him the lordship of Gwynlwyn in exchange for some of Dispenser's English manors of considerably lower value. So Dispenser became rich in November 1317, but it was really his appointment as Edward II's Chamberlain a few months later, which really catapulted him to great influence. The records of the Parliament held in 1318 show that it was at the request of some of the English barons that Dispenser had been made Royal Chamberlain, possibly in fact even against Edward II's own wishes. And somehow over the next few months and years, Dispenser managed to work his way into the favour of a man who had long been indifferent to him, perhaps had even disliked him. How he did this 700 years later, we can't really know. Possibly Dispenser was highly manipulative. But before too long, it seems that perhaps Edward had become infatuated with him or dependent on him in some way, or perhaps Edward had realised that Dispenser could be very useful to him, and that it was better to have him as an ally than an enemy. The Anonymal Chronicle states, quote, "Edward loved Hugh dearly with all his heart and mind, above all others. An Abbey annalist in 1326 even called them the king and his husband." So it does seem that some contemporaries believed their relationship perhaps to being romantic and sexual. We have no way of determining the real nature of their private relationship, but we do know that it lasted for 8 years and was only severed by Dispenser's execution. Unfortunately, we only have one surviving letter sent between Edward and Dispenser. From Edward's accounts, we know that they often exchanged letters when they were apart, but to my knowledge, only one of these letters still exists. It's now in the National Archives. It dates to 1324, and it's more a short note, really, than a letter. It's Dispenser telling Edward that there is no ship of the requisite size in the Gower Peninsula, which clearly is just a continuation of a conversation they've been having. Dispenser's letter opens, "Honours and reverences, very honourable Lord," and ends, "We would be most glad and joyful to do whatever would please you." Dispenser was in fact a highly enthusiastic correspondent, and fortunately for posterity, he often kept drafts of his own many letters, and a lot of them still exist today, mostly in the National Archives. They were seized from his wardrobe, which he kept in the Tower of London soon after his execution in November 1326. Half a dozen or so of his surviving letters were sent to Sir John Inge, or Inge, I-N-G-E, who was Dispenser's Sheriff of Glamorgan. And Dispenser's first surviving letter to John Inge was sent in September 1319, during Edward II's unsuccessful siege of the port of Berwick-on-Tweed, which Robert Bruce had captured the year before. A year or so after he had become Royal Chamberlain, Dispenser was already confident of his ability to sway the king. Inge's brother wished for promotion within the Holy Church, and Dispenser promised that he would persuade Edward that the next good church which fell vacant would be given to Inge's brother. This letter is also an excellent example of the way in which Dispenser micromanaged his affairs in his lordship of Glamorgan and took a deep interest in them wherever he happened to be in the country. Although he always called his Welsh tenants our Welshmen, this letter also reveals that he felt somewhat disdain for his Welsh tenants. And he always had a talent for feuding with people. This letter also reveals that he had some kind of ongoing vendetta against the Abbot of Glastonbury in Somerset. And he wrote to John Inge that he wanted the Abbot to be aware that, quote, "we have the power to harm him." Dispenser also managed to extort money from the Abbot. It was either £200 or 200 marks. It was a large sum of money. And further in the letter, near the end, he ordered John Inge to, quote, "harm and harass a knight called Sir Roger Seymour, on the grounds that Seymour had always been an enemy of Dispenser's lordship. So this letter, written very early on in Dispenser's career as a royal favourite, reveals certain character traits which would come more and more to the fore years later as he became more and more powerful. In another letter to John Inge in 1321, Dispenser openly admitted his ambitions. He ordered the sheriff to act so that we may become rich. His behaviour in the 1320s argues that his greed for money and lands was perhaps even pathological. However much he received, nothing was ever enough for Dispenser. And John Inge himself became a victim of Dispenser's tendency to threaten people, even though he served Dispenser faithfully for years. In the last letter Dispenser ever sent to Inge, which is dated to September or October 1322, it's a very long letter which touches on numerous different issues. But in the middle of the letter, almost casually it seems, Dispenser told John Inge, quote, Know that we trust you more the more you advise us, but we are very worried about having some reason for which we might be prepared to harm you in some way. And Dispenser was not a man to fail to make good on the threats that he made. Probably in 1323 or shortly afterwards, he imprisoned John Ing and all of John Ing's councillors in a prison in Southwark, supposedly, and made some of Ing's other followers pay him a ransom of £300 to secure Ing's release. One of Ing's councillors was called Thomas Langdon, and he died in Dispenser's prison. Two petitions presented after Dispenser's downfall regarding this matter talk of Dispenser's anger and rancour towards John Ing, though what the poor man had done to offend him, if anything, nobody knows. So if this was the way Hugh Despenser the Younger treated a follower who had given him years of faithful service, we can only imagine how he treated his enemies. The Anonymal Chronicle, again, whose author has some interesting insights into Dispenser, says, quote, "Everyone feared Hugh and hated him from the bottom of their hearts. Edward II's Queen Isabella was certainly one of the people who feared and loathed Dispenser. And when we see Dispenser's own letters, his hectoring, threatening manner, even towards his own faithful followers and allies, his utter ruthlessness in harming or imprisoning anyone he thought had displeased him or who stood in his way in whatever manner whatsoever, it becomes easier to understand perhaps why he found so little support when Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer came to England to destroy him in 1326. As well as showing his frankly gangster-like behaviour and mentality, Dispenser's letters reveal that he was a fluent reader. Some of his letters say that he had read his correspondent's previous letters out loud to Edward II and the Royal Council. His letters also reveal that he was haughty and self-important, which is, perhaps hardly surprising for a member of the English nobility in the early 14th century. But one letter to John Travers, the constable of Edward II's city of Bordeaux, says, quote, "As a result of your good conduct, the King and ourselves may discuss continuing our goodwill towards you." As we see from this letter and many, many others, Dispenser was not shy about coupling himself with the King. Many of his letters say things like, "The King and ourselves believe that," or "It seems to the King and to us that." His correspondents addressed him in very similar terms and wrote to him things like, "Please send me whatever instructions please my Lord the King and you. Sire, if it pleases the Lord King and you, I will gladly come to my said Lord and to you. I am most ready to return at the command of the King and yours." The charges against Dispenser at his trial in 1326 and several chroniclers talk of the way in which he appropriated royal power, and of course he did. He was never appointed to take charge of Edward II's government and foreign policy, but did so anyway. And as we have the drafts of many of his letters, we can see that on occasion Dispenser ordered his scribe to cross out some of the instances of "the King and ourselves," so perhaps even he realised that it was just getting too much. In 1320, Dispenser overreached himself by persuading Edward II to confiscate the Gower Peninsula in South Wales, presumably with the intention of giving it to Dispenser himself. Aggravated beyond endurance, the Marcher Lords, including Mortimer of Wigmore and his uncle of Chirk, attacked Dispenser's and his father's lands right across South Wales and England, and at a parliament held in August 1321, forced Edward II to consent to the two men's supposedly perpetual exile from England. In the autumn of 1321, exiled from his homeland, Dispenser became a pirate in the English Channel, or a sea monster, as one chronicler calls him. It's even possible that he took part in an attack on the port of Southampton in late September 1321, and it's almost certain that he returned to England on a couple of occasions to meet Edward II and to plot the downfall of their enemies, the Marcher Lords. So to cut a very long and complex story short, this plotting worked. Edward II recalled at Dispenser's his campaign against the Marcher Lords in the winter of 1321-22 resulted in their defeat at the Battle of Boroughbridge in March 1322 and in the executions of approximately 22 men, including the King's royal cousin Thomas, Earl of Lancaster. Mortimer of Wigmore and his uncle of Chirk were imprisoned in the Tower of London, but of course, as we know, Wigmore escaped in the summer of 1323 and made his way to the continent to join his allies there. But in the meantime, in 1322 and after, with most of his enemies dead, in prison or in exile, Dispenser the Younger reached the zenith of his power. By 1325, he owned or controlled almost all of South Wales and owned lots of manors across the south of England as well. He now had an annual income in excess of £7,000 a year and stored thousands of pounds at various abbeys across the country and deposited thousands more with various Italian banking firms. By the end of 1324, he had nearly £6,000 on deposit with one Italian banking firm alone, and in 1337, the extraordinarily large sum of £10,000 belonged to him and his father was discovered at Malmesbury Abbey. The two men had made themselves so rich in the 1320s that this large sum had not been missed or was not even known about until 11 years after their executions. When Edward II went to war against his brother-in-law, Charles IV of France, in 1324, Despenser's copious correspondence makes it apparent that he was the one directing the English war effort. Never a man given to modesty or self-deprecation, in 1324, Dispenser told several of his correspondents, including the Archbishop of Dublin, that no one could arrange the English response to the French invasion of Gascony better than he could. So in addition to commanding Edward II's government, Dispenser also took the opportunity to enrich himself hugely by numerous acts of extortion, blackmail and false imprisonment. There are dozens of examples. One of his favoured tactics was to accuse men of being adherents of the defeated marcher lords and to imprison them until they made a fine with him for their release, usually £100. People higher up the social scale were forced to hand over several of their manors to Dispenser and or his father. Even Edward II's half-brother, Thomas of Brotherton, the Earl of Norfolk, was forced to give up his lands between the rivers Severn and Wye to Dispenser the Younger for considerably less than their real value. And Dispenser even took the lordship of Usk in Wales from his own sister-in-law, Elizabeth de Burgh, daughter-in-law of the Earl of Ulster. Of all the numerous examples that I could talk about, I'll just briefly talk about one of Dispenser's extortions here, because his own letter on the subject still exists in the National Archives, and it reveals very much about him and his methods. So there was a Baron John Botertort and was married to Maud Fitz-Thomas. They were probably born in the 1260s, and they owned the Buckinghamshire manor of Isle Hampstead. At Easter 1323, Dispenser sent Botertort a letter stating that Botertort had committed and was still committing various unspecified wrongs or misdemeanours against Dispenser personally, and Dispenser announced that he would consider Botertort handing over his manor of Isle Hampstead to him as sufficient compensation for the wrongs that Botertort was committing against him. So when Dispenser wrote this letter to Botertort, he was only 5 miles away from him, but he told Botertort not to come to him till the following Monday, which was Easter Monday in fact, which was 2 days in the future, which also seems a deliberate tactic to cause Botertort to become anxious about the meeting with Dispenser and the king. Dispenser's letter also states that he had asked Edward II if he could be the one to write to Botertort demanding the meeting with himself and the king, and that Edward II agreed to this. Finally, Dispenser wrote the not entirely subtle threat that the king can hang and draw you because Botertort had received his son John the Younger, an ally of the Marcher Lords, in 1321-22. Dispenser followed up this threat by ending the letter with, "May God keep you," which is an entirely conventional ending to a letter, but seems almost absurdly out of place given that he's just threatened him with execution. Dispenser certainly employed spies and informants, and perhaps one of them had told him that Botertort had received his son, whom Dispenser called an enemy of the king. Another letter which Dispenser sent in October 1324 to the Admiral Sir John Sturmey reveals that Dispenser had a spy in the company of Roger Mortimer of Whitmore and his allies, the other English exiles on the continent. Unfortunately, as Dispenser himself said, he couldn't really commit any of the information he'd heard about the men to writing, so we don't really know particularly what the spy had told him about Mortimer of Whitmore's movements on the continent. It would be really great to know who the spy was as well, but unfortunately we don't. So 2 years before Mortimer of Whitmore invaded England with Queen Isabella in 1326, Dispenser knew that they would land in Norfolk or Suffolk with the aid of the Count of Hainault. This foreknowledge did him no good whatsoever, but he did know where they were coming. Another quick example I'll give you is when Dispenser employed an informant and enriched himself is the case of Thomas of Bishopstone in 1324. A man named Roger Lombard had, whether truthfully or not, informed Dispenser that Thomas of Bishopstone was aiding some of Edward II's enemies to flee from England from his home, the village of Bishopstone, on the Sussex coast. An order to arrest Bishopstone was issued in Edward II's name in June 1324, and both the King and Dispenser were in the village of Bishopstone on the 31st of August 1324, which hardly seems likely to be a coincidence, given that Edward II never went there at any other time in his reign, or indeed in his life. Thomas of Bishopstone, in his petition later, said that he had been forced to pay a fine of £100 to Dispenser personally in order to stay out of prison and in order to stay on Dispenser's good side. And it's clear from this situation and several others that Edward II was deeply involved in the blackmail, extortion and false imprisonment of some of his own subjects. He wasn't just facilitating Dispenser's extortions, he was actually taking part in them. And as I said, there are literally dozens of more examples I could give you. After Dispenser and his father's executions in 1326, petitions poured into the government, literally by the dozen, complaining about their actions. Dispenser the Younger made the great error of disrespecting and alienating Edward II's Queen Isabella, who had seemingly tolerated her husband's previous male favourites, but loathed Dispenser with a passion. In October 1325, safe at her brother's court in Paris, Isabella gave Edward II an ultimatum that either he must send Dispenser away from him, or she would not return to him, or permit their son, Edward of Windsor, the adolescent heir to the throne, to return to his father either. On several occasions subsequently, the Queen stated that her life would be in danger from Dispenser if she went near him, or even if she went near her husband. And in a letter to the Archbishop of Canterbury on the 5th of February 1326, she referred to Dispenser as our evil wisher. Sometime in late 1325, she promised that she would destroy Dispenser the Younger. And in fact, an interesting entry in Edward II's chamber accounts reveals that rumours swept the country in November 1325 that Dispenser the Younger had been murdered in Wales. Edward II hastily sent a group of men there to ascertain what was happening. As it turned out, Dispenser was perfectly well, but perhaps some people thought that Isabella had sent assassins to kill Dispenser. Edward II refused his wife's ultimatum, and she subsequently allied with Roger Mortimer of Wigmore and some of the other English exiles on the continent, such as William Trussell, John Maltravers and Thomas Rosslyn. The invading army landed in Suffolk on the 24th of September 1326. Exactly 2 months later, Dispenser the Younger was executed after a show trial, which consisted of a long list of accusations in French being read out against him by Sir William Trussell. One modern historian has called them an ingenious tissue of fact and fiction. Some of them are true, some are perhaps a little bit true, a lot of them are absurd. Dispenser had supposedly, according to one chronicle, refused all food and drink since his capture on the 16th of November, 8 days before his execution, so he was quite possibly insensible by the time he was hanged, drawn and quartered, and possibly also castrated. The castration wasn't part of his sentence, but two chroniclers do mention that he was castrated, and one of them was Jean Froissart, who later became a good friend of Dispenser's grandson, Edward Despenser, so Froissart might have had inside information there. Dispenser was about 37 or 38 years old at the time of his death. His father, Hugh the Elder, had already been executed in Bristol on the 27th of October. His wife Eleanor, Edward II's niece, was imprisoned in the Tower of London on the 17th of November and kept there for 15 months. And his eldest son, Hugh, who was now 17 or 18, was besieged in the castle in South Wales from November 1326 until March 1327, and subsequently was kept in prison until July 1331. This younger Hugh and Hugh Despenser the Younger's three other sons and his grandsons were to spend the next few decades showing absolute loyalty to Edward III and his own sons, and went a long way to restoring the reputation of the reviled Dispenser family. So in late 1326, the mighty and detested royal favourite was dead. The scene was now set for the first ever forced abdication of a king in English history and for the rise of the next mighty royal favourite, Roger Mortimer of Wigmore. And I'm sure we're all very looking forward to hearing Paul's talk on that particular subject. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.